So I've been doing a project recently where I'm trying to open up some of the so-called attic space above my garage for a little bit of extra storage. Things that are bulky and I don't want to keep in my basement or other places in the house, and which are in the way if I just keep them on the floor of the garage. And these have to be things which don't much care if it's hot or cold. They're not going to be damaged by it. And one of the things I've done is I removed some of the insulating panels from my ceiling, which I don't use or care about. The previous owner of this property worked on cars in his garage in the winter, but I don't need that, so I've pulled some of those down. And I have to work by myself, so I'm not going to be hoisting large sheets of plywood and such up into the rafters. So I decided on this solution of putting, I think these are technically 1x10s, just pine boards. I can hoist those up easily into the rafters and secure them with, in my case I use deck screws, but for something like this, drywall screws or all sorts of things would work. And I put them in sort of a lattice arrangement so I can reach in between them and push on them with my hands to slide them out if they're towards the back, instead of having to try to crawl up there and drag them out. You can see a few other things up here. I've got some cases stuck up in here. Some coolers. I've got a bass drum up there for one of my bands. And there's a few other items, including this bass drum. It's extremely unwieldy to get up there. I don't want to be doing that again and again. So I've tried to come up with another solution for that. And up over here, I've got a similar thing I did at a different time. In this case, I've got some heavier items, and I wanted to load them in from this other angle, and they're above the garage door when it's raised. I put the boards underneath the rafter structure and held them in with lag bolts and washers. But as I said before, this doesn't solve everything, and I've decided to put in one of these Racor or Racor 4x4 foot platform hoists. And as it says here, raise and lower using your drill. And I think they technically call it a ceiling storage lift. It's rated for 250 pounds. And it's quite a heavy box. Bought this on Amazon. It cost about $150. And I'm going to make a little video here on how to install this product, or how I'm installing this product. Meanwhile, I look outside and what kind of a day we've got here. A nice late November rainy, cold day. So let's get started. So I've got the couple of panels pulled down. Opened up this whole section of the garage ceiling and rafter area. I didn't really want to take the one down at the far end over here, but it overlaps the same part of the rafter structure that I was going to attach this new hoist to, so I decided it was better just to pull it all down. Kind of matches the other side. Anyway, so that's all cleaned up, and now I have to do a center to center measurement. It should be 4 feet, but I want to make sure that it is. So I verified these are 4 feet center to center. So I'm struggling with the terminology here because I don't know what all the parts are called, but I'm going to call these pieces across here joists. If they were in a house with a ceiling, I think they'd be called ceiling joists. I suppose you might also call them a tie beam or something, but I'm going to call them a joist. Try to stick with that terminology. Another concern with this type of thing is, what are these structural members actually rated for? I'm going to be hanging potentially 250 pounds up here, since that's the capacity of the hoist, and that's plus its own weight, which is substantial. And this is a pretty long joist without anything really holding it up except for a couple of triangular members, which are, you know, it's obviously there to form the structure of the roof, but it probably isn't really intended to be hanging a lot of stuff off of. When I put these other boards up here, I figured whatever I put up there is going to be pretty light, and it's not really going to be a problem. So it's something to keep in mind here. I know what I'm putting up here is going to be pretty lightweight, although large and bulky. So I'm going to leave the structure as it is. I'm not going to try to beef it up at all. And these are pretty substantial boards used in these joists. So it's just something to keep in mind. So opening up the box, the first thing I find is the members of the rod that goes up from the floor, so you can reach up to the gearbox that cranks the hoist up and down. So they give you this piece, and they also give you the crank section, which attaches onto that. And if you're just using an electric drill, you can chuck it up into the end, and if you're using the crank, you can do it that way. And then you've got the basic the shaft, which the cord winds up on. I've got one of the 4 arms with its pulley on the end, another arm, and 2 more arms. And then I've got what I believe are the frame sections for the platform. And this is the other half of the winch shaft, for lack of a better term at the moment. And this is a piece of bracket for the end of the winch shaft, and another one for the other end. There's a couple of cables. And then down underneath, we start out with what's probably the gearbox. Let's take a look. Yeah, so here's the gearbox. And it's got its little hinged locking plate. And the eye bolt that the hook here will engage. So there's that part. And then I've got, let's see, what is it, 1, 2, 3 parts of the platform. It's just wire mesh. Inside one of the parts bags is one half of the cable assembly with its this disc at the end of it, and the other parts bag is the same thing for the other side. What I'm looking for here is a bag of small hardware. I'm not seeing it yet. Alright, here's the other box. It was hidden in the packaging I'd removed. It looked like just a space filler. And this has got a bag of J-hooks for attaching the platform, some odd bolts and so on. This is, I think, the drive bit to chuck up the drive shaft into a drill. and another bag of bolts, and then a bag of lag screws. And what several people on Amazon in their reviews have written is that these are really pretty poor quality lag screws, and if you value your property and your car that's parked under the hoist or under the lift, and if you don't want it potentially coming down, you should probably go out to the hardware store and buy a better bag of lag screws, and I intend to do that. I've also been warned that the gearbox on some of these is pretty much free of grease, so I'm planning on going to get some grease and cracking this gearbox open to hopefully inject a little bit more grease into that. And then finally, it was pointed out by a couple people who are clearly engineers that when the hoist is fully down, the only thing that's keeping the cable from slipping is this plastic disc, which normally just acts to secure the middle of the cable in position, but it could potentially take a lot of weight under certain circumstances. And they had a good idea, I think it's a good idea, was to go out and buy a U-bolt to put right next to this disc, and thereby make sure that the cable can't slip in position on the shaft even when the cables are fully played out. And I think I'm likely to do that as well. And let's see, there was another tip that some people mentioned that it was probably a good idea to put 4 eye bolts, which are not included with this package, into the rafters and hang some chain down with carabiners or something, or hooks on the end, just as a backup in case the mechanism does let loose, that the whole thing doesn't come crashing down unexpectedly. And that also sounds like a fairly inexpensive and rational precaution, so I'm going to be taking a look at that as well. Before I make a run to the hardware store, I'm going to follow the instructions up to the point where I get to the more interesting stuff. The first step involves attaching the 3 wire mesh panels into one piece to form the platform. There's 2 outer panels and a center panel, which is identified by these sheet metal tabs that are welded on. And then the one side of each of the outer panels has a heavier set of wires on it, which obviously form the outer extremes. And then these rails, which they call platform supports, get laid under the mesh at each end and going crosswise to the lay of the mesh panels themselves. And there's something in the instructions about making sure the holes in these supports face outwards, but the holes are identical on both sides, so I think they made a design change. But anyway, these are little warning tags that are stuck on, and those are only on one side, so I took that as the cue to put those facing outwards. Well, it turns out that's not what they meant. They're referring to the support beam laying flat instead of vertically, which is the way you would think it would go according to the way the tags are stuck on these. But on closer inspection of the illustration, which is dark gray on slightly lighter gray, it didn't really pop out at me at first, but that's the way they're going, and I think they're referring to these holes being facing outwards away from the bulk of the platform. And then these holes here are also offset to this direction, which seems like it'll put this warning tag underneath the screen of the wire mesh, which isn't all that great. So I've got this J-bolt here, and I've aligned the double wires here with the hole, and it says to just drop the J-bolt through like this and then put on nuts. Now, my J-bolts came with nuts and washers, so even though they don't say to use the washers, I'm going to put them on underneath the nuts. So I've got a J-bolt now at each corner, and over there, and that's loosely holding the platform assembly together. And then the remaining 8 J-bolts are put in at the junctures of the panels. Just to take a break from hunching over on the floor doing this stuff with the platform, I decided to do a little of assembly. I've got the shaft here with the shepherd's crook at one end, and I've got the bit that goes into the chuck of a power drill, and it's inserted like that, and the holes have to be lined up. And then you've got some hardware like this. I'm wondering if it would make more sense to put a sort of a hitch pin in there that could be more easily removed. I may investigate that at the hardware store. So I decided to come inside where it's a bit warmer for a moment and make sure there's enough grease in this gearbox, based on warnings I'd seen from other people who had had troubles with theirs and found they were just about dry of grease. So I'm going to risk opening this up, unscrewing this one bolt. Allows this pin to slide out here, and then the whole locking assembly comes off. And now I gotta flop this guy over, and this side has 6 Allen bolts. I presume they're metric. Let's find out. Yeah, so it's a number 45 metric. Fits into here. So here are the 2 short bolts and 4 long bolts, and this will probably just lift right off, and it does. It's a nylon bushing in here and a worm gear. I'm not sure if that's metal or plastic. It's probably metal. And it looks like it's adequately lubricated to me. It's got lots of grease on it, so I'm not going to mess with that. Just going to carefully put it back together. And I did notice that some of these bolts here were pretty loose. It took almost no effort to turn them from their home position. So some other people had noticed that these were almost finger tight when they got them. So I think at the very least it's a good idea to go through here and, you know, snug them up a little bit before use. Now this is an interesting thing here. They've got a spring detent steel ball here with a spring and a set screw, and that helps this thing lock in. Probably to this hole here. And it's not too easy to do this. Well, it's pretty hard to do with one hand, but this does work like a detent here. It holds this pin into the eye bolt here, and then you have to put a fair amount of snap on it before it pops open. This ball pops out of this hole. So that's the locking mechanism. So the next thing on the instructions is to assemble the arms together. We've got these 4 arms. They're reasonably heavy sheet metal, and they have a resin pulley at the end. Somebody wrote online that these are like a fiber-filled pulley, and that's probably adequate for the task. The cables are sleeved with a vinyl or some sort of a clear sleeve around the steel cable, so they're not going to be abrading this. And even if these were to crush for some reason, you'd still be on the metal bolt, so it wouldn't fall due to that. Anyway, there's 4 apparently identical arms, and then there are these 2, I think this is called an axle support, and there's 2 flavors of this. They're basically identical, except one has this plastic bushing in it and the other one doesn't. And the one that doesn't is because it's using the gearbox to support the shaft on that end. With the gearbox oriented this way, the axle support goes on like this, and it attaches with these 4 bolts that are provided, and they give you a short Allen key to attach them. So that's done. So now 2 of the arms get put onto this axle support. They give you these long machine bolts, 8 of them, and hopefully 8 nuts, and these just go right through like this. Here's a pair of holes, and then another bolt goes like this. Now these arms don't actually carry any weight in this direction. They're really just there to keep the pulleys in position relative to the crank assembly here, or the winch assembly. The arms get anchored with the lag screws in 4 places on each arm to the joist, and the joist is what's holding the weight, especially the one at the end, which is the one that's closest to the pulley. So the arms themselves are only really needing to be strong in this direction so they don't collapse in this direction when the strain is put on the cable. And that's what these bolts are for, just to hold that assembly together in that regard. Alright, so I've got the 2 arm assemblies together. That's interesting. As I bumped at the rail on this side of the platform, which was only finger tight according to the instructions, flipped over on me. Before I run off to the hardware store, I want to make sure I know what I'm trying to buy. So here's the cable already looped through this plastic bushing, and that will go over the square part of the winding shaft, or the winch shaft, or whatever you want to call it, that the cable will wind up on. Presumably in this round section, not the square section that goes in more towards the middle. And it's been observed that, you know, this is all well and good here, but if you had the cable totally played out for some reason, and maybe this isn't a big deal with a normal height, like an 8-foot ceiling or a 9-foot ceiling in a garage, if you did have the high enough ceiling and the cable was paid out completely, it could just be like this, in which case the only thing that's keeping the cable from slipping off the end of the winding shaft and totally dropping whatever's left is this plastic piece, which doesn't inspire confidence. You'd like to believe that they've done the engineering on this, but still, it was observed by a couple of people who tried this and had good luck with it. Is there's room on here for a U-bolt to go around here and lace through this, so that it can't possibly pull off this part of the shaft even if this plastic piece fails. So I'm going to take one of these shafts to the hardware store and see what I can do to implement that modification. Well, back from the hardware store, I've decided to try a cotter pin here instead of the bolt that's furnished with the product. And that would allow me to more rapidly change between the drill-powered coupling and the hand crank that's furnished. So that may actually turn out to be unwieldy or a problem in other ways, and I can always go back to the bolt. So here's the original lag bolts or lag screws that are included with the product. They are very lightweight. They almost feel like they're made out of aluminum. They certainly don't feel substantial. I ended up getting some 1/4 inch by 2 inch zinc plated steel lag screws from the hardware store. I think the originals might be metric, so it's clear that the new ones I got are a little bit more substantial, a little bigger in diameter, and I suppose they're not going to fit through the holes the way that the originals did, so I don't see much harm in opening these up a little bit with a drill. I also got a bag of suitable washers to go with the lag screws. I don't think they're strictly necessary, but I feel better putting them on. So I've got the two structures up here now. I put the side with the crank and the gearbox on the side closest to the center of the garage to make it a little easier to access. And as I pointed out before, this product is designed to work with joists that are 48 inches apart on their centers, which is normal. But if you had joists that are not on 48 centers, you can put some planks or 2x4s or whatever between the joists and then attach these structures to those 2x4s or other planks. Or if your joists go perpendicular to the way the frame should go in your particular setup, you can also put some interposing boards, 2x4s, whatever, in between the joists and attach them to those structures. I did use all of the recommended mounting points. There's a total of 10 on each one of these rails. 2 of them right in the center by the winch, and then 4 more distributed out along the length, one of them right at the end by the pulley. For my backup chain system, I've got these eye hooks or eye bolts that are going to go up into the rafters right next to where the pulleys are at each of the 4 corners. And I've got some chain to hang down, and I'm going to need to hook the chain into these eye bolts, so it's going to be necessary to either saw out or grind out just a little bit of the eye here to make room for the links to go through. So I think I'm going to take care of that now. So here's the way I cut away the eyes, just enough to get the chain links through. I don't think this makes them any weaker, because it's not like they were welded at the junction or anything. So I think that should be fine for this purpose. So here's how I put the eye bolts just outboard of the pulleys. Then these 2 halves of the axles, which is for winching up the cable. As I pointed out before, they're basically a square piece of stock with a circular part or a tubular part put on around the outside for the cable to wind up on. And they're shipped in 2 pieces, and they're simply joined in the middle with a couple of bolts that'll go through. And the next thing to do is put the cable assemblies, and these plastic rings at the end need to now go over the square parts at the ends of the axles. Rather like this, with the main length of the cable facing inwards towards the center of the axle. And I have these U-bolts I got at the hardware store. And I'm trying to thread them up so that the U-bolt goes on the outside of the cable on one side of the axle and the inside of the cable on the other side of the axle. So this is how I have the U-bolt laced up. The cable comes through the disc, goes outside the U-bolt, then tucks under it, and then goes out the other side of the disc. And this way the cable is laced around this U-bolt, which isn't going to come off. And even if this disc fails for some reason, which I agree probably won't, but if you did get to the point where the cables are fully extended, they could just slide this way and potentially cause some sudden drop or shifting of the load. And hopefully by going under it this way, it's secured a little more firmly to the end of the shaft. I'm going to see how this works. And then I've tightened them up and snugged them enough to bend the plate a little bit, and then sawed off the excess bolt length on the U-bolts. So the axle does telescope like this, and it isn't until fairly near the end that the bolt holes appear. So in this way the axle can be made shorter and fit in between the bearings up on the brackets, and then be telescoped out until the ends fit in. So that's the next step. So here the axle is telescoped out and joined with a couple of bolts. Obviously the round end goes in the end with the plastic bushing, and the square end goes in the side with the gearbox. They give you a cotter pin to put through the shaft on this end, just as a further prevention to keep it from falling out if everything goes south. You can see here there should be pretty good clearance between the U-bolt and the bushing over here. I decided to put a little bushing on the end of this to make sure that the U-bolt doesn't hit any of the bolts that are holding the gearbox onto the bracket. There's plenty of play there, and this bushing isn't taking up all of the play. It's just going far enough that the U-bolt can't hit the mounting bolts. I happen to have some of this stuff around here, and I just bored out the center. It's a good enough diameter, but you could use a stack of washers, or even a piece of wood with a hole drilled through it would really work. It's not a structural part, it's just a simple spacer. So here's my little spacer in there. You can see there's still adequate clearance between the plate and the nuts on the U-bolt and this projecting bolt that holds the gearbox onto the bracket. It just can't go any closer. So it's still got a little play there, but it's not going to go any closer, so that should be pretty good. Then the cables have to be threaded through the pulleys. So I make sure I've got the pulley that comes from the right side here. Take off the washers. So there's the one on that side, and then the pulley on this side. So now I've got all four cables, and they're all just swinging a bit clear of the floor. So now the platform is hanging from the four cables. The cable's already made up with the fold back and the two U-bolts, and you just have to stick it through the hole with a couple washers and a nut, and there's some tweaking to get it so the tension's more or less even on all four corners. And it's probably a good idea to go at these things with a wrench and make sure they're all reasonably tight. So I've gone around and tightened all the little U-brackets here. Every one of them was quite loose. So it's a good thing I did that. They do mention it in the instructions to make sure they're tight, but it's easily overlooked, so I think that's a critical step. And the cables will all be more or less the same tension as long as they're not immediately, hugely different lengths. It's more about getting the platform level, and I don't have a level garage floor here, but as near as I can tell, it's pretty level at this point, so I'm not going to adjust it anymore. But you can adjust it up and down by moving the two nuts on either corner, on either bolt. I should say again, you can adjust the platform for level by loosening and adjusting the two nuts on any of the 4 bolts at the corners of the platform. So the remaining step here in assembly is to tighten up all these little J bolts. So I go up here and I pull the safety catch out of the way, and then I engage the eye hook up here. Then I re-engage the safety up there. I have one cable that's decided to come out of the pulley. I think it was out before I started. All the others are on here good. So that goes up pretty well. So now to lower it, and by the way, I can walk around underneath here. There's plenty of headroom on what I think is a standard height garage. Pull it out of there, re-engage this. And while I've got it up here, you can see how the cable rolls up on the winch part of the axle. And it goes through the pulleys, like it should. Over on this side, same thing. And you can see by the time it gets up there towards the point where it can't really go much higher, the cables are going at a pretty good angle onto the winch part, and if it was much more, they would start rolling over each other, which is obviously undesirable. So people who are thinking they might be able to add longer cables to these and have them work with a higher garage might find they have a problem in that regard. And I pulled my little cotter pin out here so that I can demonstrate the crank that comes with this. Okay, so now I've got the crank on here. and you can do this type of thing. It takes a lot longer, obviously. So I'm going to go back to the drill for this. So the installation seems to be successful. It all worked pretty smoothly. And now I'm going to get some things out of here to put on the platform. So I've got some of this stuff on here that I wanted to get up out of the way. It's not extremely heavy. I've got some lawn chairs, and since a lot of this stuff is for a local band, I've got some horn reflectors in a bag and a bass drum and a couple other things on there. And now I'm going to winch it up for real and see how it goes. Okay. So it's definitely working harder now that it's got a load on it. It was real easy before. Have to be careful I don't hit the beam with the top of it. I think that's probably about as high as I want it to go. I can still walk underneath it, just barely. So you have to keep in mind that you can't put any really tall things on here the way it's set up. The cable's still wrapped on there nicely, so there's no problem there. And I can walk around on here. You kind of got to watch out for these little bolts sticking down. Those could cause some injury to your head if you happen to hit those. I'm really surprised they didn't do that better. Another small complaint on this is I found when you tighten these J-bolts, it wants to flip these beams over this way, because the pull on that's so off-centered. I think that's also a rather poor design. I have no idea what this stuff up here weighs, but I know it doesn't weigh 250 pounds, and that's the rating of this hoist. So I'm going to close this out here, and the way you do that is, see if I can zoom in on this a little better. Adjust it so it's so the eye bolt up there is straight like this, and then disengage the hook and then go up here and push it over like that, and it has that spring-loaded detent up here which snaps in place so it holds it and it can't unwind. So the remaining thing I'm going to do is put the chains on here. So I'm trying to do a selfie here. I don't know how this is working out, but I'm 5'8", and you can see there's just about a fist's height here of clearance, but not as much between that and these bolts, so that's definitely a worry. I'm thinking of cutting those off or doing something different with those. Maybe putting a nut on the end, at least one of those acorn nuts, to soften the blow if I do hit it with my head. Okay, I've hooked some lengths of chain onto the eye bolts up at there that I put in earlier. Here's another one. One at each corner, and just for the moment I've got them hanging. Let's see if I can zoom out. For the moment I've got them hanging a few links below the platform. It won't hurt to hit those. And the idea is to put a carabiner on here and clip it onto these larger eye bolts. So here's the carabiner. The chain is almost tight, just loose enough that I can manipulate the carabiner on the chain. So it might drop a half of an inch or something if everything lets loose. But I'm going to do that on each corner, and by leaving a little bit of extra chain here, if I ever do decide to lower it down a notch or two, I've still got enough chain to hook it onto. So that concludes this video of the Racor or Racor 4x4 hoist.